Welcome to the collision.
The Collision, where sports and politics smash. Thursdays at 10 a.m. and on iTunes and Google Play. WPFW, Washington, D.C.
At 89.3 FM, this is member-supported WPFW, Washington.
And welcome, listeners. You're listening to WPFW 89.3 FM. Also, WPFWFM.org. It's a pleasure to have you here in this hour. I'm David Whettstone, your host for Community Watch and Comment, the Wednesday edition. And I want to take care of some housework since you're joining us, whether you're a new listener or old. Recently, WPFW has finished its summer fun drive. We are a Pacifica Foundation radio station. That means public broadcasting, community-based, and importantly, listener-supported. So I want to thank each and every one of you that support this hour of programming and the station, WPFW, 44 years strong, going into its 45th year, bringing you jazz and justice because you, the listener, decide to support us. You decide to connect with us with financial wherewithal, but also with the social. Even in this pandemic, also with the social. And that's important. That's terribly important given today's topic, homeschooling Black children in America, a growing practice. Our guest this morning is Dr. Khadijah Z. Ali-Coleman. Dr. Coleman is the co-founder of the Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars, known as BFHES. And she's the co-editor of the Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling book series and hosts a podcast under the same name. Dr. Coleman's recent research has included a study which examined the preparedness for college through interviews with 8 African-American dually enrolled teens who attended community college in Virginia, Texas, and Maryland while being homeschooled for high school. And she's the co-editor of a forthcoming book, Homeschooling Black Children in the U.S., Theory, Practice, and Popular Culture. Dr. Ali-Coleman, good morning. Without further ado.
Good morning, David. It's so great to be here. So good to be here.
Well, you know, being a friend, a colleague, and a regular listener of sorts, you're probably aware of that since the pandemic, I've been asking guests, how are they doing? And that's going to take a special turn throughout this broadcast. But go ahead. Let us know how you're managing with things. And I'm sure the rest of the show will reflect how the pandemic has affected, impacted and even reflected your work?
So thank you so much for asking, because yes, in addition to being a veteran homeschooling mother, I am also the director of education community outreach at a media organization in the DMV area. And so I've been remote for the entire year now. And the work that I do as a researcher and with BFHES has been completely virtual for over a year now. I actually earned my doctorate. I did my dissertation the week right before quarantine last year. And so the COVID-19 global pandemic has definitely impacted me in ways that I can't even begin to stop talking about. I mean, every avenue of my life. So thank you for checking in, because I'm hanging in there. And I'm realizing that for maybe the first 3 months of last year, when the COVID-19 pandemic became a thing, we were planning for, just for the right now, right? We didn't think that this was going to last as long as it has, but now we're in it, and we realize that this has really become the new normal. So,
yeah, a deciding factor on many occasions, no doubt.
Right, exactly. So,
I want to also give a shout out to Liberated Muse, because that's a performance arts group that reflects not only your role as an popular educator, but also a writer, as you said, mom, teacher, leader, singer, and performer. So
if you can imagine, this past year, like, we haven't really been gigging. Last summer, this summer, all of the things that we normally would have been doing in terms of visiting schools and museums and libraries and performing, we haven't really been able to do that. Actually, our biggest performance, that was our last big performance, was last February, when we were honoring Toni Morrison at the Kennedy Center. So, yeah, thank you for mentioning that, because, that's been a big shift for me as an artist.
So we'll proceed to our subject at hand, homeschooling.
Yeah.
Homeschooling Black children in particular.
Mm-hmm.
Let me do a popular history of homeschooling for a moment.
Okay.
It's always been a dynamic that children have been educated in homes. But particularly at the close of the 60s, going into the 70s, certain, not my favorite term, but certain subcultures, certain groups of our society became increasingly concerned, not only as parents, but as communities, of how and why and where and when and all the other considerations of children being educated.
Mm-hmm.
When you hear homeschooling nowadays in popular culture, a lot of people think of white elite parents and communities that either have a strong ideological bent toward conservatism or liberalism, and have a sense of independence and even some degree insularity from the society at large.
Mm-hmm.
Those who watch this aspect of culture also notice that the children are usually either embraced with their special needs,
mm-hmm.
or another aspect, the children who are being taught at home are high achievers,
mm-hmm.
often thought leaders in media and in politics, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not the whole picture of what is going on with homeschooling. And it's particularly informative if we pay attention to Black communities, parents, youth being students. That is very important. So let me ask you this. Why don't you, in the context of this show, redefine homeschooling and give us a typical example of what it looks like?
So that's even funny when we talk about typical, because homeschooling itself really lends itself the opportunity for a parent or family to create a learning environment that's specific to the unique characteristics of their family. And so while many people think of homeschooling as you said, it started, if homeschooling kids are these crazy kids with no social skills, and the parents are extremists, as you talked about, with the conservative bent, typically white. Well, the reality is that there is no norm when we're talking about Black homeschooling. We talk about homeschooling in general, and so it's not typically this replication of a traditional learning space, which so many people think that you're trying to really duplicate what someone will find. And when I say traditional learning space, from here on out, I'm talking about public, private, charter school, compulsory education, right? And so I know for my family, I homeschooled my daughter off and on for 13 years. And she was in the public school system. She went to we're from Prince George's County, Maryland. So she was in the public school system for some time. And so when we began to transition out in her early elementary school years, there were some facets of it that were traditional. Sometimes we had a curriculum for math or some of the subjects, but a lot of times we created curriculum. You'll hear terms in the homeschooling community such as unschooling and deschooling. But all of these are really pathways to curating your child's learning experience. And one of the things, if there's anything traditional about the practice itself, is that the parent is the curator. And so curation doesn't always mean that the parent is going to be the lead facilitator. Parents aren't expected to know who knows every subject, right? But they are curating this experience. So that may look like engaging with a contractor or going to a homeschool co-op or collective where many parents maybe trade off with teaching subjects or hiring someone to come and teach subjects. Or some parents have found it helpful to maybe do some facet of virtual learning, but virtual learning by no means is the extent of that learning experience. And so when I'm speaking to folks about homeschooling, it's really talking about, when we talk about typical, there is no typical when it comes to homeschooling, because it's really reflective of the family themselves, the parent, and many parents engage their children as co-facilitators, if not lead facilitators of that learning experience.
I'm glad you gave us a fully orbed definition there. And the thing that leaps out is that it can be not an isolated, insular, retreating experience, but a collective experience, yes, reflective of different responsibilities to one another.
Yes.
In appeal to African descendant or Black communities, it would reflect kind of an Ubuntu.
I love that. Yes.
I am, because we are.
Yes. Yes.
So.
And, some families have different, we know extroverts and introverts personally. So if you can imagine, some families are very collective and very engaged in homeschool cooperatives and what have you, where some, they pick and choose. I can tell you that I call myself, I make a concerted effort to be extroverted, but I am an introvert at heart, and my daughter is as well. And so we definitely navigated in and out of collective spaces, but a lot of things were very family oriented, where it was, her dad and I doing things, whether traveling or things as a unit. And then we would pick and choose when we would join others. And so that's what has been so blissful of this experience for us, is because it's so uniquely created based on the needs of our family.
So we'll give people a sense of scale. I was listening to several news reports and also some of the resources of the organization Black Family Homeschool, and which you're very much a part of, and we'll explain all that. But one surprise, or was that, well, let me just get to it. Homeschooling has increased twofold in the District of Columbia. So it made me think, let's just ask, what percentage of homeschooling families are Black families? And you folks, the folks you work with in your own research, have turned up a number of observations from the 2020 census.
Yes. So to answer that, I really have to just give some context, because I just graduated last year with my doctorate from Morgan State University, and the program was community college leadership. And so I had this bright idea to do a study on the perceptions of dual enrolled homeschool students and their perceptions of preparedness for community college. And, if you can imagine, folks are like, what? And so I taught college for over 10 years and had a lot of students in my classes who were dual enrolled, who were homeschooled, and there was really no literature on this population, right? And so even in homeschooling, when I talk about literature, I'm talking about the research. And even when we talk about homeschooling, it always tended to focus on white families. And so before COVID, so we're looking at years, research really ending 2018, Black homeschoolers were maybe 3 to 5% of the population of homeschoolers in general, whereas homeschooling families as a whole, regardless of race, were less than 2% really of P through 12 age school children. And so when you talk about twofold, we're talking about like 500%. This recent study from the U.S. Census Bureau found, and they really looked at the limitations of their study, realizing it was a small sample size, but pulled from that since COVID in 2020, Black families were 16% of all families are homeschooling. Now, their demographic based breakdown was kind of questionable to me because really how they characterized Hispanic families, the breakdown, it wasn't a racial breakdown, but 16% in comparison to previously 3 to 5% is quite a jump. And so last year was probably something where we're not surprised because many of the schools were transitioning to virtual learning, really hit hard with the pandemic, really floundering in many cases, not able to transition very well. So many families were deciding this is a prime time for homeschooling because the schools don't really seem to get it together. But also what came out of this pandemic is that when students were being virtually taught, seeing some of the dynamic between the teachers and the children, and many parents, particularly those in our Facebook group, when we started having conversations as to why now, why are you trying to homeschool now, is that they didn't really like what that dynamic between teacher and child. They also had a time to look closer to the curriculum. And homeschooling, because of all those things that I mentioned before, really being unique to the family, to what the parent is feeling is important for their child to really be focused on and be learning. This was a time for many of them to say, you know what, I can really do this better. All of us now are in flux. Why not me being able to take the lead? And the thing is that, I've been asked quite a lot from media outlets and from folks, is it because of racism? And, critical race theory has become like this talking point now. But even when I did my research and my study before COVID, looking at the literature, Black parents have been unhappy for a while with the curriculum, the lack of culturally based, relevant curriculum for their children, the consequential impact of schools really criminalizing behaviors of Black children. For the same things that a white child may do, it now becomes a criminal penalty. These things were existing before COVID. So it's really important for us to know that COVID didn't really unearth that much, what we already knew, but it really provided the landscape for now parents to be empowered to begin to make that shift.
Listeners, you're listening to Community Watch and Comment. Allow me to reintroduce Khadijah Z. Ali-Coleman. Dr. Ali-Coleman is talking about homeschooling Black children here in the United States. And it's a pleasure to have you again, Dr. Ali-Coleman. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
So we're surmising that the preliminary, the initial findings have demonstrated a 500% increase
right
on the part of the homeschooling done by Black families. And I said earlier that particularly the point of origin of this broadcast in the District of Columbia, homeschooling in general has increased twofold.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about how Black families are redoubling their concerns about how their children are treated, how students advance, and what skills and training they have. Some would say that out of our Black communities, given differences in income and other resources, that it's not possible for most families to actualize all the stuff we've talked about thus far.
Right.
What would be your answer? What would be your response to we're insinuating that homeschooling is not necessarily that difficult, that it's natural and organic to families, but take us a little further.
So that's a great question, because, I get that all the time, as a homeschooling parent and as a researcher. My colleague, Dr. Cheryl Field-Smith, who's actually the co-founder with me of Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars, she actually released a book last year on single Black Black parent homeschooling. So in her book, she explores and interviewed a subset of women from all over. And when I say all, rural as well as urban based single mothers homeschooling their children. And her book talks about the varied ways and many of the sacrifices. And that's the thing that I think really puts Black homeschooling families apart from this white normative idea of homeschooling, I think, where you believe that it's this two-family home that is, upper middle class, that it's necessary for the mother primarily to be home to facilitate this process. But you can talk to scores of Black families who are homeschooling and understand that there is no normative look. You have families, I know in our group, we have families who, where both parents, I worked, the entire time that I homeschooled my daughter. I'm I co-parent with my partner, but you have mothers who are working, whether they're virtual educators, teaching other people's children, or engaging in some type of work that allows them to really adjust their hours. It's a sacrifice, but it is definitely something that you see different demographics within the Black family homeschooling community making it happen. And so it is not something I tell everyone who asks. It's not an easy adjustment if one is unwilling to recognize the sacrifices that are involved. For me, what that meant professionally is that I'm not going to necessarily take leadership positions and things that I'm qualified for and that I have a history of doing if it doesn't allow me the flexibility that I need to be able to travel somewhere and take my daughter to this opportunity, or to really, if we're world schooling is a name that's given to those who homeschool by traveling the world. And that in itself sounds very elitist and privileged. But I know of a parent, a woman by the name of Jade Wetherington. She's actually someone who's very highly active in our group, but really known within the homeschooling community because she's a single mother. She was a former public school teacher who decided to begin virtual teaching. And then her on a platform, I forget the name of the platform, but she became so successful that she then hired other homeschooling mothers to be able to teach and to have that flexibility to teach others while homeschooling their own children. So there's so much dimension to the possibilities that families can really engage in to be able to support themselves as well as to homeschool, and to look outside of this view that it's impossible if you have to work. It's impossible if you don't have this background in teaching. There are many folks who are doing jobs that aren't educationally based. They aren't, teachers in formal lives. And because that's what I get as well. It's like, you're a doctor, you have an education background. That's different than over here. But we have folks who are small business owners, notaries and things that aren't really necessarily education based, but still making it happen because this is, they're flexing their interdisciplinary muscles.
Dr. Khadijah Z. Ali-Coleman, you have pointed to what's present, but also what's legacies. Mm-hmm. And I like to strategically reiterate some things that you just said. Black parents have always made a way out of no way, particularly in caring for their children. And this is something that we know. Mm-hmm. You hear stories from high achievers by good measures, not by worldly measures, not by the established systems, but people that we clearly know are high achievers for not only for their own selves, but for the community, mm-hmm. for society. And here are the stories they'll tell. My grandma got me a set of encyclopedias. Mm-hmm. On my bookshelf, on our family bookshelf, J.A. Rogers was talking about historical Black facts, or my auntie made sure that my penmanship, that I could write very well. You hear these stories over and over and over again.
Yes.
And hopefully we don't lose them. I think the examples you just mentioned about, especially learning by travel, have a lot to do with the struggle of Black folk. And very much it's not neglecting the fact that when you talk to a child, whether you're blood kin or a responsible elder in a community, mm-hmm. you are that child's teacher.
Yes.
And what's fascinating also is a reconciliation of if there are issues of trusting the public system. Well, during Reconstruction, regular listeners to the show will know that Black folk in the South made significant contributions to forming schools and a system of public education for everyone.
Yes.
For everyone.
Yes. So my great-grandmother and great-grandfather were part of that.
Yeah, there's a long-standing tradition. Mm-hmm. Leaders like Julian Bond. I mean, his father was an important educator. The historian John Hope Franklin plays a significant role in in education within Black communities.
Right.
So the examples are countless. Before we head for break, you've been mentioning your research and what you conducted. Did you want to expand on any remaining notions of your findings, anything that you think might be important that we need to think about for a little while while we have you with us?
Oh, my goodness. Thank you so much for allowing me to even share that, because the thing about my study is that I interviewed the children, the homeschool children themselves, not their families. And so much of the literature that exists around homeschooling focuses on the parents themselves and what they believe, what they're doing, why they're doing it. But the children themselves told me so many great things that I think whatever type of educator you are, I think is important to hear. One of the things that consistently stood out for me was how they found value in being able to self-pace, to have the opportunity to learn at their own pace, not feel rushed. But if they wanted to take more time on whether it was math, a lot of them mentioned math, they had the freedom and the opportunity to do that. But also, for many of them, because all of these children had experiences, except for one out of the 8, in public school spaces. And all of them had experiences in school spaces where they didn't necessarily need more time to focus on something. They actually wanted to accelerate and go farther. And everything from a teacher not believing them that they were capable or that they were telling the truth if they said that they already read something or they had already completed something, to examples of having to just really wait until this teacher got to it because the rest of the class wasn't on the same page. And so those instances, I think, are significant for folks to hear that homeschooling, we don't realize how much in the classroom is focused on classroom management. And it's not, you don't have the opportunity to really tailor it to your child in particular. So that was something that really stood out for me.
Again, listeners, we're talking to Dr. Khadijah Z. Ali-Coleman. Dr. Ali-Coleman is talking about homeschooling Black children in America. We'll continue that conversation after we have some public service messages. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
It's August 13th to the 19th to celebrate 14 years of the African Diaspora International Film Festival, DC. Discover thought-provoking films from Cuba, South Africa, the United States, Mexico, and more. Opening night film, The Sleeping Negro, a superb character study of a black man in America today. Other films include Maya and Her Lover, about a mature woman looking for love in the wrong places, and Angelica, about being a woman, black, and Puerto Rican. The DC African Diaspora International Film Festival this year, 100% online in DC and surrounding states starting August 13th. Tickets, schedule, and films at nyadiff.org. That's nyadiff.org. African Diaspora International Film Festival, where Black Life Matters. WPFW, serving 100% of the 99%.
And welcome back to Community Watch and Comment, the Wednesday edition. I'm your host, David Whettstone. On that public service announcement, you heard the voice of Louisa Mutali, one of the co-producers and hosts of Africa Now, which comes on your terrestrial broadcast here at WPFW 89.3 FM at 1 p.m. Wednesday. Today's show of Africa Now will focus on the recent Zambian presidential election, which resulted in the opposition candidate defeating the incumbent. So there's a story to be told about Zambia right now. The show also will proceed to talk about the recent impact of the earthquake in Haiti with Eugenia Charles. Ms. Charles is host and producer of Combe Lake, which is on Saturdays at 9 p.m. right here on your Jazz and Justice radio station, WPFW FM. Also available on WPFWFM.org. And there's a whole lineup of Caribbean programming on Saturday evenings. I urge you to tune in. Not to neglect all the bountiful programming, which we're thanking the listeners for their recent support in our summer fund drive. There's also a show dedicated to education. You Must Learn with Baba Aize, and that's 6 p.m. on Thursdays. So I hope you tune into that and other programming available by broadcast, on the internet, and social media platforms you most likely use. Search us out. Find us. Support WPFW, 44 years strong, because you, the listeners, support us. Dr. Ali-Coleman, again, so much thanks to your being with us in this hour. And we're discussing the important subject of homeschooling Black children in America. So you were talking about findings, and you were honoring the voice and agency of the young people you actually care about and what you do.
Yes.
What are some of the ways that parents begin homeschooling a child, especially if they previously have been in the school system?
Well, there's so many ways. There's a term. What you'll learn the more that you study Black homeschooling, and homeschooling in general, is that it's a culture, and it's been on the fringes for so long. But now a lot of this terminology, this jargon, I believe is going to become more, normative. And so there's a term called deschooling. And for a lot of families that transition into homeschooling, deschooling is that process where you're really trying to detach yourself from the idea of learning only happening in the classroom.
And you're not trying to recreate the classroom.
Exactly. But what many parents realize is that because children have spent so many hours of the day in the school, that they may not be as familiar as they thought when it comes to certain things as to what their students' strengths are in terms of what they gravitate toward educationally. What are the things that they may not really like, but it may be because they didn't excel in it as compared to something else. So that deschooling process is a really an opportunity to get a sense of who your child is as a learner, and also to really assess what are the goals that you and your child have educationally. I recommend often a mission statement, which sounds very weird, very nonprofit-ish, right? But a mission statement could be very helpful, and many homeschooling families engage in creating, what is this mission? What do we want this learning to be about? What are those outcomes? In traditional learning spaces, outcomes, that's a very common term, which refers to what is the child able to demonstrate when they take this course or finish this lesson. And so that is something I find that is still helpful in this schooling process, to kind of get a grasp on what all your possibilities are and begin to plan those opportunities for your child. For many parents, it could be anxiety ridden, because again, some parents go into this believing that they're inadequate and that they don't have all the tools. But what those of us who are veteran homeschoolers and what researchers will tell you is that once parents begin to really relax in the process and to look at this process as something that can be both intuitive but also collective, as you mentioned, then they start to relax and to make it more of something that's not as traumatic as it, some make it.
Yeah, and life is full of drama, particularly in this present age.
Oh my goodness.
If we can help listeners and parents and concerned relatives and friends of families and friends, particularly of youth, can we try to maybe take away a barrier or two? And one of them might be the financial barrier, because the accusation has been that a lot of homeschooling, I'm not saying necessarily homeschooling with Black families, but that its subvention, its support has come from conservative sources bent on destroying public education. And I like to say, even before you answer, the Black parents I know that are doing homeschooling are wanting to work with any and all environments that their children are in. So that's not the case as far as the principal people we're talking about. But if you could say something further about the financial barrier or the social influences and directions, maybe you could take away a few of the fears that some who are considering homeschooling might have.
Wow, so that's a very nuanced question. What I can say,
sorry.
Well, what I can tell you is that right now, because homeschooling is such a trending thing, that you're definitely going to see the ecosystem really be broaden, and you're going to see a lot of folks wanting to capitalize off of this population. That's real, okay? And that's, I think, for anything. And I think that we're seeing a lot of folks trying to really get those homeschooling dollars coming to parents where I can offer this class, I can do that. What I would like to say is that, you spoke earlier to Black people always making a way for our children. And, and I had mentioned my great-grandmother, my great-grandfather in Louisiana, and they were some of the early people working with Rosenwald schools. Are you familiar with Rosenwald schools?
Yes. Why don't you tell the listeners? Yeah, that's an important historical phenomenon.
Right. And for those who go to the Blacksonian, that's what we call the the Smithsonian in DC, dedicated to African American history. But Rosenwald schools, at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, is a philanthropist, a white Jewish philanthropist named Rosenwald, who was working with Booker T. Washington on funding schools for Black children, right? But rather than just give the money, Rosenwald decided that he would fund those schools where the need was demonstrated. And the need was demonstrated based on this idea that we have called matched funds. And those who are in the nonprofit world know what matched funds are, is that if you're going to get some funding, like let's say an organization gives you $10,000, but they say you have to demonstrate matched funds, you have to show that you're also getting $10,000 from another source. So what Rosenwald required was that these communities that were to get his funding to build a school, they had to have the money that he was going to give, match it with the money that he was going to give. So Black families did everything from, church, fish fries, all the things that we know we do to raise money. And so this is the same. I see this in our homeschooling communities where parents are making it do what it do. And so they're doing everything, these collectives. And so a lot of the funding that comes from these spaces that don't wear black faces, I think that is very important for us to be very critical as to where this money is coming from and the why behind it. I know that I have been offered money. I myself I offer services to homeschooling parents and children as well. And I have a problem. I am critical when I'm asked to share information for those of the children and the families that I serve. I'm critical when my name is going to be attached to some type of agenda that is not matched with what I believe in. And so that is really what I think the question that you're asking, David, is, we're going to see this more and more. We're going to see this because folks are going to want to attach themselves to this movement and really really try to make it seem as if black families are not at the helm and are not knowledgeable enough to know what it is that we're doing. And I encourage folks all the time to be critical all the time as to where the money comes from.
So we just briefly touched on the social context, and we're trying to encourage people to at least really consider this dynamic of homeschooling, particularly for black families and black children. You have a colleague who is a co-editor of a forthcoming book, and it's called Homeschooling Black Children in the U.S. Practice, Theory, and Popular Culture.
Yes.
And the 14 authors, the 14 contributors are in some way either homeschooling parents or researchers.
Yes.
So it supports some of the things you just said. Certainly in this hour, you've demonstrated why it's important to put it out now. But give people a sense of the range of concerns that we haven't spoken to that might be reflected in this book. Again, Homeschooling Black Children in the U.S., Practice, Theory, and Popular Culture.
Okay. Well, I definitely want folks to check for our book, but I want to say the names of some of the authors who are included.
And who's your co-editor? I'm sorry.
Right.
That's important.
Yeah. So I want to drop some names that folks can Google to learn more. But my co-editor is Dr. Cheryl Field Smith, who is actually the most prolific researcher. She's been doing this for over 16 years now, researching black homeschooling families. And she is a professor out of the University of Georgia, who is part of the department that teaches teachers. So she's in the education department and she teaches teachers on how to teach, right? But her research evolved from looking at homeschooling in comparison to traditional school spaces. And so she and I are co-editors, but we also have a chapter in the book. My chapter, of course, is looking at dual enrollment, as a choice for homeschooling, but there's Malika Diggs, who is one of the premier voices on unschooling and this idea of schoolishness. There's Cheryl Carter, who's out of New York, who is talking about her husband and her journey homeschooling their children from a Christian perspective. And so it's just everything that you can imagine. Yeah.
Oh, so you can go further.
Okay.
We still have a few moments.
Okay. We have Kathleen Mons. She is a professor who also has homeschooled her children out of Georgia, and she and her husband are graduates of Spelman and Morehouse, and so they knew that they wanted their children to have to be able to go to a competitive college, and so in the chapter she talks about that journey. But everyone isn't really that's not a goal for every family, college or that type of pathway. And so we have other folks in the book who are talking about just the traditions, some of the things that we've been talking about, David, how homeschooling is aligned with this idea of activism. And one author, Laura Smothers, talks about it from looking at it from Ida B. Wells and how she was an activist and an educator and standing up for Black people, and how homeschooling is in that same vein of work. So it's just the volume is going to be very powerful, I believe.
And thank you for that shout out, because I'm sure you were aware that we had an educator, Michelle Duster, who was the great-granddaughter of Ida B. Wells, talking about a recent biography.
Oh, yes. I love Ida B. Wells. She's one of my personal heroines.
And thank you. And you've given me an opportunity to do a back announcement, or a back ad, as we say in the business, and remind people that you're listening to Community Watch and Comment, the Wednesday edition. Our guest is Dr. Khadijah Z. Ali-Coleman. And congratulations, Dr. Coleman, on your educational doctorate and a lot of the hard work you do, not only within the realm of education, but for this community. Baltimore folks and Washington, D.C. folks and Prince George County folks probably have heard of you or have seen you somewhere giving a speech, doing a performance, lifting up the written word and lifting up the process.
I appreciate you, David. Thank you.
So, and it's guests like you that have appeared all across the grid. So I'm going to keep up the housekeeping for a second. At 3 p.m. today on Wednesdays, there's Sophie's Parlor, music and culture by women, but for everyone. And often who's ever hosting a particular Wednesday will have guests. Shay Wanana at 2, covering Middle Eastern affairs. We know that's terribly important right now. And at 1, as I said earlier in the programming, Africa Now with host Mwiza Mutali. Today's show will cover the recent election in Zambia and the situation in Haiti. But importantly, don't forget the blues every weekday at noontime. And I suspect Dr. Nick is substituting for Clarence the Bluesman Turner, which is your usual host on Wednesdays. All that and more because you, the listener, have decided either on a large scale or a modest scale in these hard times to support your Jazz and Justice station, WPFW 89.3 FM, Jazz and Justice going into its 45th year. I thank you. Dr. Coleman, I don't want to leave anything out. I want to say if people want to find out more information about your organization and the resources that are out there, they can go to Black Family Homeschool, squash that together as one word, put a dot behind it, and put ORG. BlackFamilyHomeschool.org.
That's right.
We'll give you the information. And Dr. Ali-Coleman, I would like you to just repeat the organization's name so people hear your voice and not mine.
That will be Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars. And you can find us at blackfamilyhomeschool.org or blackfamilyhomeschooling.org.
And your organization is committed to a regular podcast and book series called The Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling.
Yes,
so
sir.
The struggle and striving continues. And let's head out on a very, very good note, both personal and broad.
Yes.
You know, we are concerned about our youth. We are concerned about the generations that follow us. And we want to honor the rich treasure and legacy that elders and ancestors leave for us. Reiterate, how are Black homeschooled kids, or youth rather, who grow into adults, how are they faring in terms of work and in terms of school?
So the literature prior to COVID, if you have read any academic research that looks at the academic success of homeschooled children, regardless of race, in comparison to those who are traditionally schooled, if success is academic, aspiring to higher education, children who are homeschooled in higher education are more likely to persist, which means to continue throughout without any gaps in their college schooling. They're more apt to graduate, and when they graduate, they're more apt to achieve higher GPAs in comparison to those proportionate to their population, of course. And so that's often what many parents are looking for, is like, will my child still be able to go to college? Will my child still be able to find a job or to have opportunities? And the answer is definitely yes.
And in your voice, in your heart, in your spirit, and those who join you, we want these young people to really grow up to be happy,
yes,
centered, determined, lifelong learning adults.
Yes.
And
yes.
I believe that you're contributing to that effort, and I thank you for it. I congratulate you. We said earlier at the beginning of the program that you're coming to us by Zoom, safe social distancing, folks, from San Francisco, where you're getting your daughter acclimated to attend the University of San Francisco.
Yes.
And congratulations to her. I won't embarrass her, but she received a full scholarship.
Yes, she did.
And, you know, we don't live by anecdotes, but we live by witness. And that's a witness to what things can be done through homeschooling. Listeners, you've heard Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman. She, again, is the co-founder of Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars. She is the co-editor of the Contemporary Perspectives on Black Homeschooling. It's a book series and podcast. All the information you need about this issue can be found at Black Family Homeschool, one word, .org. Dr. Ali-Coleman, thank you so very much for being with us. I, once again, as I do every week with under God's good graces, thank Mike Nassala, our engineer in the News and Public Affairs Department of WPFW. The WPFW family of programmers, my hat is off to you, both music and public affairs programmers, and the listeners who responded to you to support this station. There's still time to do that, folks. You can always go to WPFWFM.org, click a bright red button that says donate. If you're particularly inspired by a particular show, be sure to identify that in the steps. Coming up next, don't forget the blues, which I believe, if my eyesight can see through Zoom, Dr. Nick's there getting everything ready. Thank you, Dr. Nick. And the news 5 minutes before each hour. Folks, thank you for being with us. We're building a world, one broadcast, a better world, one broadcast at a time. And I wish you well. Perhaps we'll meet again. Take good care.
Join us August 13th to the 19th to celebrate 14 years of the African Diaspora International Film Festival, D.C. Discover thought-provoking films from Cuba, South Africa, the United States, Mexico, and more. Opening night film, The Sleeping Negro, a superb character study of a black man in America today. Other films include Maya and Her Lover, about a mature woman looking for love in the wrong places, and Angelica, about being a woman, black, and Puerto Rican. The D.C. African Diaspora International Film Festival this year, 100% online in D.C. and surrounding states starting August 13th. Tickets, schedule, and films at nyadiff.org. That's nyadiff.org. African Diaspora International Film Festival, where Black Life Matters. WPFW, serving 100% of the 99%.
Peace. This is Baba Ize, your WPFW programmer of the 6 p.m. Thursday weekly liberatory educational show, #You Must Learn. I'm inviting you to join us this Thursday, August the 19th, from 5 to 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a special 2-hour radio show that will feature experts and educators as we explore critical race theory, CRT. What is it? Why is it causing an uproar? And what you can do about it. So join us this Thursday, August the 19th from 5 to 7 p.m. Be there. Peace.
Welcome to The Collision.
The Collision, where sports and politics smash. Thursdays at 10 a.m. and on iTunes and Google Play. WPFW, Washington, D.C.
From WPFW in Washington and WBAI in New York, I'm Sue Goodwin. Today is Wednesday, August 18. Here are some headlines. In Afghanistan, the U.S. and other countries continue evacuating their own citizens today after the Taliban seized power on Sunday. The White House said Tuesday at least 11,000 Americans were still awaiting evacuation. Meanwhile, calls are growing for the U.S. to accept more Afghan refugees. More than 300,000 Afghan civilians have been affiliated with the American mission over its 2-decade presence in the country, according to the International Rescue Committee. The Special Immigrant Visa, also known as SIV, is offered to people living in Afghanistan and Iraq who supported the U.S. military. In a joint letter Tuesday, 43 Democrats and 3 Republicans urged the administration to create a new category of humanitarian parole for Afghan women, civil leaders, and others, especially vulnerable to the Taliban. The lawmakers also urged the White House to streamline the paperwork process to allow for fast, humane, and efficient relocation to the United States. In Haiti, officials raised the death toll from a deadly weekend earthquake by more than 500 on Tuesday after Tropical Storm Grace forced a temporary halt to search and rescue efforts. The death toll following the 7.2 magnitude earthquake now stands at over 1,900, with nearly 10,000 injured. Haiti's Civil Protection Agency anticipates those numbers will climb, noting that many people are still missing. According to USAID, more than 80,000 homes have been destroyed, and the United Nations Children Fund estimates there are now 500,000 Haitian children with limited or no access to shelter, health care, clean water, or nutritious food. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and the United Nations says it has allocated $8 million to go toward getting emergency shelters and clean water to Haiti, but much more is needed. House Democrats introduced legislation on Tuesday to reauthorize sections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that have been gutted in recent years by the Supreme Court's conservative majority. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is meant to undo Supreme Court rulings that gave states and jurisdictions more leeway to put restrictions on voting access that are now being enacted at an alarming rate. Congressional lawmakers will vote on the bill when they reconvene next week at the end of their August recess, but the potential of a Republican filibuster narrows the odds the bill will make it through the Senate. Groups supporting the voting bill are planning a march in several cities on August 28 to call on the Senate to remove the filibuster rules. The Texas Supreme Court ruled on Tuesday that the state's House Democrats can be arrested if they refuse to attend the state capitol to conduct legislative business. More than 50 Democrats fled Austin in early July in an effort to prevent the necessary quorum needed to vote on an elections bill that would place new restrictions on voting and discriminate against voters of color and disabled voters. The court's decision is a win for House Republicans and lifts a temporary restraining order a county judge issued last week, blocking arrest warrants. The State House Speaker last week signed 52 civil arrest warrants for Democrats who were absent without excuse